say thank you to Vessel and to the ADAPT Center for inviting me here to speak with you today, and thanks, of course, to all of you for coming in out of the sun to enjoy some food for thought, hopefully. So let me just say a few things. Vessel has already done a fine job of introducing me. I am a philosopher. I'm an ethicist. I also work with a lot of groups that involve interdisciplinary collaborations with ethicists, engineers, computer scientists, industry leaders, regulators. For example, I'm an executive board member of the Foundation for Responsible Robotics, which is a group recently founded in the Netherlands to promote responsible robotic design and development. I also work with the IEEE Standard Association's new global initiative for ethical consideration in the design of artificial intelligence and autonomous systems. So I'm very interested in doing the kind of philosophy that is not for philosophers. Unfortunately, there's a little too much of that going on already. But the kind of philosophy that actually is for the human family as a whole and the kinds of practitioners that are shaping our future. And really, the future for the human family will be profoundly shaped by the kinds of technologies we choose to develop, how we choose to use them and implement them, and how we choose to learn from our successes and our failures in the development of technology. So that's the kind of work that I try to do. And my book that came out last year from Oxford University Press is an attempt to formulate a philosophical foundation for this kind of work. So here's the bullet points, the sound bite, the claim of the book as a whole. So my assertion in the book is that if humanity is going to have any real hope of not merely surviving, but flourishing in the 21st century and beyond, then we're going to need more than just better technologies. And let me emphasize that I do think we will need better technologies, that we can't hope to flourish without technology. So nothing that I say today should be interpreted to suggest that I am anti-technology. In fact, I want more of it. I want more and better technology. But we can't stop there. So the emphasis of the book is that we also need to think about the ways in which we will require ourselves to be better humans, and specifically humans that have cultivated the kinds of moral skills and virtues that are needed to manage our new techno-social powers wisely and well. If the word techno-social throws you back a bit, let me just explain. I use words like techno-social and technomoral throughout the book, not as a way to sound pretentious or confusing, but simply to indicate that technology should not be considered in isolation from the social environments in which it operates, and technology should not be understood in isolation from its consequences for our moral condition. And it's deeply implicated in both. Likewise, you cannot, I argue, understand society independently of the technological practices that shape it, and you can't today understand morality independently of the technical practices that mediate it. So I see technology, morality, and society as mutually connected in ways that can only be artificially pulled apart. So how do I define ethics? So I define it in the very broadest sense that anyone could connect with or understand. It's a shared human concern for living well with others. That is to say, flourishing as the fundamentally social creatures that we are. If we were wired differently, if we didn't have the kind of deep-seated social needs and desires that we have, then ethics might not exist, or it might look like a very different sort of thing. But for humans, for the kind of creatures that we are, ethics is a way of thinking about the kinds of lives that we want to live with one another. Another way of saying that is that it reflects the unending human search for the good life, where that notion has a moral meaning, right? Not just the good life in terms of getting a lot of fancy things or being more successful than other people in a purely economic sense, but where the good life means living a life that we would be proud to have been known for, that the kind of life that we would not only choose for ourselves, but for our children, the kind of life that we can admire and that others can admire. So here we're talking about the intellectual and moral task of figuring out what kinds of lives we ought to seek to live and what kinds of persons we ought to try to become. Okay, so one question I often get, especially from technical audiences, is a question about what does ethics have to do with technology. And I've said a little bit about that, but let me just say a little bit more. So one thing to consider is that the connection between technologies and ethics is not new. Technologies have been interwoven with ethical practices for all of human history. Just think of one example. Think of the invention of the bow and arrow for hunting, right? And think about, or the long spear. Now think about the way that not only enabled us to hunt game more effectively, but it also created moral possibilities and moral choices that weren't there before for us. For example, the potential to, from a position of relative safety and concealment, take out a stronger human rival from a distance, right? In ways that would be more difficult to do without the development of these kinds of long-distance weapons, right? So from the very beginning, our technologies have shaped the kinds of moral choices that we're presented with, and therefore the kinds of people that we have the opportunity to become. So technologies are not value neutral. So I always push back against this idea that technologies are mere tools, that they have no moral significance or valence, that the morality is only in the hands of the user. Because technologies always reflect and embody human needs, human desires, human expectations, human judgments. And another way of thinking about that is to consider that every technology presupposes a vision of the good life. They are made to help us live better. Sometimes they succeed, sometimes they fail. Usually the effect is somewhat mixed, but they're all ways that we have engineered to improve our lives. So you can think about technologies in general as tools of moral intention. They're tools that we use to try to engineer a world where we can live better than we currently do. And sometimes that is just living better in a material sense, but it also often implies desires to live better in a social sense. The other thing we have to mention is that ethics has a great deal to do with our habits. And as a virtue ethicist, someone whose work is rooted in philosophies like those of Aristotle and Confucius, this emphasis on moral habit is extremely important. Virtue ethics is an account of human character, the kinds of traits and dispositions and skills that we develop in ourselves that we're able to carry into the world with us on a regular basis. So traits like honesty, or courage, or empathy, or wisdom. And these kinds of traits are shaped by our habits and practices. The way Aristotle put it, we are what we repeatedly do. So when Aristotle's talking about ethics, he says, okay, how does one become, for example, a courageous person or an honest person, or a just person? He says, well, one begins by repeatedly performing honest acts or courageous acts or just acts. That performing a just act does not automatically transform you into a just person, but repeatedly performing just acts and cultivating the skill of acting appropriately with respect to justice and learning how different sorts of contexts require different sorts of responses in order to be just or fair. This sort of pattern, this sort of habit, this sort of skill building will eventually transform oneself into a just human being. That was Aristotle's claim. Okay, so we are what we repeatedly do. Now consider that nothing shapes and reshapes our habits faster than new technologies, right? Let me just give you some examples. Many of you, whether you realize it or not, are in the habit, and this is especially for those who are digital natives, but as someone who did not grow up with digital technology, and who didn't get a computer as a regular feature of my life until my late teens, I can testify that I'm guilty of this. Many of us have a habit of checking our mail now 200 times a day, maybe more. However often you think, if you have a smartphone in particular, however often you think you check your mail and your notifications, it's more than you think, right? Now, that's a habit we couldn't realistically have had, or only a very disturbed person 100 years ago would have had the habit of checking their mail 100 times a day, right? There's no point to it. But we do this now, and it's normal. We have a habit now of walking while looking down, and not making eye contact with the people around us, and not noticing the changes in the physical environment around us. In fact, you might have a building that goes up in your neighborhood, and it might take you months to notice that it's gone up, if normally all you do is walk by it, because most of the time, many of us are walking around like this. You have a habit, some of you perhaps, of talking to your devices now, talking to your television, talking to your phone, talking to your car. If you don't have this habit, within 10 or 20 years you will, because all of your devices will be trying to talk to you. And in fact, many of your devices won't work unless you talk to them, right? Now think about how the habit of talking to all of the things in your environment might transform your character. And I don't want to presume that it will change it for the worse, right? But how will it change the way you talk to people, for example? These are really interesting questions. Most of us are not in the habit anymore of having a 30-minute uninterrupted conversation. Certainly most of us, I can't remember the last time I had actually the only time in memory I've had a 30-minute uninterrupted conversation on the phone is with a journalist, which I just did in my hotel room. But that's really it. I don't talk to my family in this way anymore, which is quite interesting. And even when we meet face-to-face, think about how often you sit down for 30 minutes with someone, especially, again, someone who has a smartphone, and it isn't interrupted, right? Or where you and the person don't communicate through the device, right? You share things, you share photos, you share notifications. So this one-on-one focus with a person can actually feel quite oppressive and intimate sometimes to younger generations, because they're not used to that sort of close, attentive focus on another human being. Okay, think about the moral implications of that change in our habit. Think about the habit of reading a newspaper from start to finish versus the habit of clicking through a series of images. And my local online newspaper now, the SF Gate, which is the online face of the San Francisco Chronicle, about a third of the articles I find now, there is no story, there is no text. It's a slideshow with a series of captions, and that's how the news story is conveyed. Okay. So if we are what we repeatedly do, and we are being rapidly reshaped in our habits by the affordances of our technologies, then clearly this must have some profound implications for the kinds of people we're becoming and the kinds of moral virtues or vices that we develop. So this is the thesis of the book. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about ethics and innovation. So this is something that in Silicon Valley, where I work, I often get into conversations with technologists about ethics and innovation, and there are some ways of thinking about that that I think can be unhelpful. And I want to talk about that briefly. It's important not to think of ethics and technological innovation as mutually limiting or antagonistic. So sometimes you'll hear someone say, ethical innovation is an oxymoron, right? Innovation is inherently simply just an attempt to make something new for some purpose. And ethics is a developmental process as well. Ethics in human history has been an attempt to constantly improve upon our practices, our social relations, our forms of governing with one another, our forms of living with one another. So in some sense, ethics is a form of social innovation as well. So one way of also misunderstanding the relationship is by seeing technical innovation as automatically replacing or doing the work of ethics, right? Saying, look, well, we don't need ethics to make a better world because that's what technology is for. as if every innovation automatically makes a moral advance in society, right? In fact, sometimes it helps, sometimes it gets in the way. But ethics is something that simply cannot be replaced by technology. So not all innovation is progress. It's also important to understand that ethics need not be seen as a rigid or backward-looking way of existing in the world. So sometimes technologists will think that if I'm talking with them about ethics, first of all, that I either want them to adhere to very rigid rules of conduct that they want to disrupt or break up or destabilize, or that I'm trying simply to hold on to older traditional ways of existing at the expense of moving forward, right? And this need not be true at all. In fact, as I've said, often in ethics, we're rarely satisfied with how things are. So we're almost always looking to move things forward in some way. So the sort of model that says, look, don't talk to me about ethics, just embrace change, don't live in the past. Ethics is not about living in the past. Ethics is always about the future. Okay. So it's important then to recognize that innovation is not just change that happens to us, it's change that we choose in ways that reveal our values. So when we make a certain choice to adopt a new technology or a new set of technosocial habits, we're actually making moral choices, or we're revealing our moral preferences as we do that. So we have to resist the kind of slogans that tell us that innovation is inevitable, that its particular path is determined by forces outside of human control, that we just have to adapt or die, that innovation in a particular form is inevitable. Elon Musk has recently told us that we have to merge with the machines or become irrelevant, right? As if we are presented with no options here, that our agency is irrelevant. And nothing could be further from the truth. Every technological innovation is a result of certain human choices and priorities and power structures. So how can we get the story of ethics and innovation right? We can see innovation, technological innovation, as a mode of ethics, right? It's one way of trying to make a better world for ourselves. We can also get it right by understanding that because of the tight connection, although not the identity, between ethics and technological innovation, we need to pose ethical questions in technical spaces. And this is something that I do all the time, right? I go into technical spaces and ask ethical questions. But just as important, I think, is the reverse. That technical questions, technological questions, be asked in ethical spaces. This is something I actually have a harder time doing, is getting philosophers to understand the importance of thinking about technology when they ask questions, not just in the domain of ethics, but also in the study of knowledge and all the things that philosophers concern themselves with. And unfortunately, it's often difficult to make philosophers or ethicists receptive to the importance of technological practices in mediating our norms and our values. So then this reunification of ethics and technology, I think, needs to happen. We also need to take moral responsibility for the values and ideals that our design choices reflect, right? And the consequences that they have. Okay, but ethical innovation is really hard. So here's why it's hard. Emerging technologies present new problems of collective action. They occur on much larger scales than the kinds of technologies that were developed in the pre-modern era, which would be invented in a local community, and they would spread through networks of trade and so on, but they would spread and be adapted by other cultures very relatively slowly. And today we have technologies that instantly link everyone across the globe and require them to cooperate and engage in collaborative decision-making across cultural and national boundaries. They also have impacts on scales that no one group of people can manage. So think about the impact of our industrial technology on the climate, right? No one can solve the climate problem alone. No one country can solve the climate problem alone. So this is a problem of collective action on the largest possible scale. Okay, why is this happening? There we go. It's a problem on the widest possible scale, and unless we have good skills of collective action and deliberation, we're not going to be able to manage it. Emerging technologies also impact future persons, groups, and systems as much or more so than existing stakeholders, right? So it's difficult enough to think about what's in the human interest right now, or what's in the interest of the stakeholders on the planet right now. But many of the technologies that we're developing today will impact the shape of the planet and the conditions for life on this planet 100, 500, 1,000, even on longer time scales than that, years from now. So how do we make decisions for people 7 generations ahead of us? These are very challenging problems. Emerging technologies also have highly unpredictable and open-ended consequences. This is something I focus on in my book quite a bit. I'll return to it in just a moment. But basically, it's impossible to predict what the future is going to look like. Even if we talk about something that's already emerging in society, like artificial intelligence or social robotics, there are so many different ways that those technologies could be developed. And so many uncertainties about how they'll interact with our other technologies and with our political and environmental context, that trying to make very specific predictions about what the future is going to look like is very hard to do. That becomes a challenge for ethics, especially if you operate from what's called a consequentialist perspective in ethics that says, well, to know what's right, you just think about what will have the best future consequences, right? What will promote the greatest happiness overall. Problem is, a lot of times we really can't make good predictions about the consequences of our technological practices. There's a lot of uncertainty. Emerging technologies also resist binary moral judgments very often. So we, in simplistic terms, sometimes think about ethics as a matter of right and wrong, but those kinds of binary descriptions aren't really appropriate for a lot of our technological choices. So if you ask me the question, should we develop social robots? My answer is not going to be yes or no. Or if you say, is it right to develop social robots or wrong? I would say, well, that's sort of a silly question, right? The question is, what kind of social robots are we talking about, and how are we going to use them? And what sorts of capabilities are we going to give them? And what sorts of norms and practices are we going to develop around social robots, right? There's a whole story that has to be told. So new technologies are really not the sort of things that we're invited to accept or reject in many cases. It's a question of how we incorporate them in our lives. Emerging technologies converge and interact in unexpected ways, which magnifies the uncertainty. So think about the intersection of artificial intelligence and robotics, the intersection of artificial intelligence and big data analytics. Think about the way in which quantum computing might magnify other kinds of technologies like artificial intelligence. So we often have a single technology that can have different kinds of effects when it's combined with other technologies that currently exist or that might come soon in the future. Emerging technologies today, because we have such a globally networked society, seep and flow globally. They cross national, cultural, and religious boundaries, which is a challenge for ethics because we're used to thinking of ethics within local contexts, right? We have the ethics of particular religious groups, the ethics of particular national or cultural identities. Well, these increasingly come into conflict with each other because our societies and practices are being bridged, whether we like it or not, by these sort of technological phenomena. So we have to be able to think about ethics in non-local and non-parochial ways. We have to be able to think about ethics as a shared human concern again, something that really shapes the future for the entire human family as a whole. We're really not used to thinking about ethics on that level. And then finally, emerging technologies present existential risks and opportunities. What that means is some of the emerging technologies we're developing have the potential, unfortunately, to make life on this planet either impractical or potentially degraded to a condition that would not be worth choosing, right? So think about the ways that certain technologies could magnify the climate warming to a degree that human life on this planet would just become inherently unstable, such that no particular policies or political controls could stabilize it. You can think about the risks that, and I discourage taking these too seriously. I take them with a very large grain of salt myself, but the kind of risks that people like Stephen Hawking and Elon Musk are worried about, of artificial intelligence becoming smarter than humans and seizing control of our systems of production and perhaps deciding to enslave or destroy humanity. Again, not the existential risk that keeps me up at night, and for reasons that are informed by conversations I've had with a lot of AI developers who think that that kind of prediction is a little bit silly, but some people take it quite seriously. There are a lot of risks with emerging technologies that could potentially present these scenarios. Think about geoengineering as a hypothesis or the use of gene drives to control or restore threatened animal populations that are suffering under climate change. These are technologies that could help save or preserve the conditions for worthwhile life on this planet, but because of the potential consequences, they could also do more damage than good, and they could actually imperil our existence. So there's so much uncertainty that when we look at the future, right, the more we understand about technology, the more opaque the future gets. We used to think about technology as something that gives us a vision of what the future is going to look like. Quite the contrary. The more we know about technology and the way it works today, the more cloudy the future looks. Okay. So the question of the book then is, given these unprecedented conditions of what I call technosocial opacity, right? The inability to see what the future of technology and society together might look like. How can we continue to do ethics in any serious and useful way? I said that ethics was future-oriented, right? It tries to create conditions for a good life for us tomorrow, and for our children tomorrow, and for our future generations. So how can we do that if we don't know what the future is going to be like? So I don't argue in the book that this problem can simply be solved or gotten rid of. It's going to be a persistent problem for the foreseeable future. But I do argue in the book that there's a particular way of thinking about ethics in the philosophical traditions of the human family that is ideally suited for handling this kind of condition. And that's the philosophical approach known as virtue ethics. One of the interesting things about virtue ethics also is that it has arisen as a form of ethical thinking independently in many different cultures at many different points in history. It seems to be a way of thinking about ethics that humans are naturally able to take on board. Whereas, it's not the case that something like Kantian ethics and the categorical imperative, it's not like you necessarily see analogs of that popping up in cultures all over the world. Now, it's true, and I emphasize this in the book, that different cultures have very different versions of virtue ethics. That is, their conceptions of what a good person is and what human flourishing is, what a good life is, they look very different. So the Confucian vision of the person of exemplary moral character is a very different sort of person than the person Aristotle described as the exemplary moral person. And both of them are quite different from how the Buddha would describe the exemplary moral person. So even though there's Confucian virtue ethics and Buddhist virtue ethics and Aristotelian virtue ethics and Christian virtue ethics, and some people say there's even Nietzschean virtue ethics and so on, every different version of virtue ethics paints a different picture of what a moral person is and what a good life is. But there's some interesting points of agreement, though. They all focus on the importance of practices of moral self-cultivation. That is, all traditions of virtue ethics think of character as something that has to be built, and has to be built through our habits and practices, as I mentioned earlier. And in the book, I point out that there are some cornerstones that seem to unite different virtue traditions across cultures and across historical periods. And these are practices that, in some way, each tradition seems to gesture toward as important for moral development. One is just the developing of moral habits that I've mentioned earlier, so I won't say more about that. Another is the practice of developing relational understanding, learning how to understand the duties and benefits that attach to certain kinds of relationships, relationships in the family, political relationships, relationships between citizens. Practices of reflective self-examination, right? We can think about the kinds of practices that in, for example, Roman times, philosophers like Marcus Aurelius practiced through meditations, narratives that one would develop about one's life and one's practices that served as a way to reflect upon the choices you've made and the habits that you are cultivating and the virtues that you're cultivating in your life, and resolutions to perhaps improve upon one's habits and thus improve one's character. So all of these different virtue traditions have ways of focusing attention on your own habits and practices and noticing how they're shaping your character. Practices of intentional self-direction, sort of moral goal setting, actually envisioning the kinds of lives that we want to live, envisioning the kinds of people that we want to become, and thinking about how we can modify our actions and habits to get there. Practices of moral attention, thinking about what's morally significant, what kinds of things do we want to pay more attention to. So think about the Buddhist tradition and the way it emphasizes the importance of attending to and noticing suffering, right? And becoming responsive to suffering. Or think about the way in which in the Christian virtue tradition, there's a lot of emphasis on attention to need and vulnerability and weakness, and identifying those who need our assistance and love and charity. Or think about, in the Aristotelian tradition, the emphasis on attention to the health of the political society and how one can improve upon and work with others in one's community to better govern the political society, the polis. So in each case, there's an emphasis on attending to what is most important around us. The practice of prudential judgment, learning to make careful and discerning judgments in particular contexts and cases. One thing that's true of virtue ethics that's not true of many other moral systems is that virtue ethics rejects the idea that there are firm, unbreakable, universal moral rules that apply without exception, right? So every moral principle in virtue ethics is merely a heuristic. It's a guideline, but it cannot be simply applied across the board in every particular case. So virtue ethics is quite particularist. It looks at individual contexts and cases and says the moral person must decide what the appropriate action is in that case. And there can be better or worse decisions made, but there's no rule that prescribes the action for them. So you have to be able to develop your own skills of moral judgment. So practices of moral discernment and judgment become very important in virtue traditions. And then finally, in most, if not all, virtue traditions, there's an emphasis on practices which in the Confucian tradition are made, Confucian and Buddhist tradition are made most explicit. Practices of extending moral concern. Taking your natural moral concern, which might in some cases be just for yourself or more likely for your kin, and learning how that moral concern for oneself and one's kin is appropriately extended outward to others, right? And deciding where, if anywhere, those boundaries ought to be drawn, right? How far forward or how broad your concern needs to be. And also modulating it appropriately, right? Should you care for a total stranger, should your concern for them be as strong as it is for your own child, right? And different virtue traditions will give different answers to these kinds of questions, but they all have a concern, all talk about the practice of deciding appropriate boundaries and degrees of moral concern for others. Okay, so what I argue in the book is that we can use these resources, even though these resources were developed in extremely different cultural and historical conditions from those that we face today, they actually work very well for the kind of situation that faces us, the kind of technosocial capacity. So for example, if you don't know what the consequences of your technical choices are going to be, or you can only make rough guesses, then a utilitarian ethical theory that tells you, well, calculate the consequences, calculate all the suffering that will come about as a result of your actions, and then all the happiness, and then do the math and choose the path that brings the most happiness, those calculations are going to be so rough that the utilitarian theory becomes, if not useless, at least not as helpful as we need it to be in conditions of opacity. Likewise, rule-governed or rule-based theories of ethics that try to apply principles or rules universally to all moral situations tend to fail because of the complexity and diversity of technosocial situations that we're confronted with. And the emphasis in virtue ethics on judgment in the situation, and also resilience and flexibility in being able to use moral intelligence to correct ourselves, right? To examine our habits and practices and reshape them constantly. This allows for a kind of resilience and flexibility in our moral responses. And so I argue in the book that what we need to think about is how to develop something like contemporary practical wisdom, and practical wisdom is the word that virtue traditions use to sort of capture all of the moral skills I was talking about. How we can apply that kind of practical wisdom to living well with emerging technologies. So I'm going to go through these very quickly because I have a few more things I want to talk about. But in the book I name some of these virtues, and I give some detailed explanations of how those might apply in an environment dominated by the kind of opacity and disruptive change that comes from emerging technologies. So I talk about technomoral honesty, which I describe as a reliable disposition to express respect for truth in technosocial contexts, especially in new information practices. If you want to try to understand how that might apply to our contemporary situation, all you have to do is think about the last couple of election cycles in the United States and in the UK, and think about the disinformation campaigns carried out on social media that were quite effective in distorting truth, in making it impossible for people to discern truth from fiction, from creating a certain sense of license to believe whatever you would like to be true, to attach to certain conspiracy theories, which can be given a certain kind of legitimacy and power through information technology and social media that they could not have attained before. So to have a respect for truth is much harder today than it was before. And the systems of authority that we had developed, scientific authority and political authority, as imperfect as they were, right, and as corruptible as they were, those were systems that helped us remain oriented to the truth in our social and political environments. That task has become more difficult now. When a task becomes more difficult, you need to cultivate even stronger moral skills and virtues to meet the challenge. So I talk in the book about how those kinds of adaptations might be sought. Think about the ways that new technologies often challenge our self-control. I mentioned the checking of our email 200 times a day, right? Or walking around, crossing the street, looking down. Most of us know that's not really good for us, right? I mean, I don't think too many of us think that this is the smartest way to go about one's day, and many of us do it anyway, right? So the technologies in many cases are wired to undermine our mechanisms for self-control. I've talked with app developers who will be quite honest about this, that the technologies are deliberately designed with knowledge of behavioral psychology and the way that human motivations can be manipulated and co-opted to make us engage with technologies that may or may not be, in ways that may or may not be in our interests. So we have to develop then stronger skills and virtues, specifically the virtue of self-control, in order to manage that. I talk about the importance of humility. I talk about the importance of justice in technosocial environments, the importance of courage, that is intelligent fear and hope about both the dangers and the opportunities presented by emerging technologies. I could talk at length about each of these, but we'd be here all day. So I'm going to move through these, but I'm happy during the question period to take some questions. The importance of technomoral empathy, allowing technologies to help us develop a cultivated openness to the plight of other members of our technosocial world and to be moved to caring action with respect to their needs. That's connected with the virtue of technomoral care, that is actually being good at caring for the needs of other people. So think about, for example, the way that social robots are increasingly being developed to care for us, to care for our elderly, to care for our children, to care for hospital patients, right? Now, think about how difficult it is to learn to care for people well. If there's anyone in the room who has ever cared for someone who has been in need or sick, a friend, a child, a parent, you know how challenging that can be. And you know that it's a moral skill, right? To care well for somebody in ways that are patient and responsive to their needs. That takes an incredible amount of moral character. Well, that means you need to have practice in order to get better at it, right? And you need to have the right kinds of conditions. So interestingly enough, I argue in some of my work that robots can help us or hurt us here. They can help us if they can take some of the physical and psychological burdens that make it impossible to care well for someone. If you've ever had to care for someone 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, you know that at a certain point you just break down, right? So given the demographic challenges where we don't have enough human caregivers to care for a population that's living longer, we might need robots to sort of help us carry this burden. But I also emphasize in the book that caring for each other is not just a burden, right? It's also part of how we become the sort of people that we want to be. If you were the sort of person that could not care for anyone else, you would be a lesser sort of human being than you are. So think about the practices that we need to have of caring in order to remain those sorts of people. And imagine a scenario where we were encouraged not to have robots help us care for each other, but have robots care for us instead of caring for one another, right? A situation where we're encouraged to leave our children or our parents or our sick and vulnerable in the care of robots instead of people. And imagine that the robots did a really good job and that our children were happy and our elderly parents were happy, but we then became detached from the skills and practices that cultivate the virtue of caring. I don't think this is a future we should want. Civility, I don't need to talk, I think, too much about the ways in which civility and the ability to make common cause with people from very different political or cultural orientations and value systems has degraded in the contemporary world. And we need technologies that help us get better at rebuilding civil discourse, rebuilding the cooperative skills and motivations of democratic peoples. Flexibility, perspective, the ability to not sort of get absorbed in things of relatively small significance and lose sight of the bigger picture. We need technologies to help us with that instead of making it harder. Moral leadership, nobility of purpose, and the virtue of technomoral wisdom, which really is a consolidation of all the virtues together, right? Wisdom is a general condition of well-cultivated and integrated expertise. In this case, in the book, I call it technomoral expertise. And it embodies bringing together all the virtues of character that we need individually and collectively in order to live well with emerging technologies. So I'm going to go through now just a few kind of case studies to get you to think about some questions of virtue in the technological context. So this is the first case. So back in February of this year, Eric Schmidt, who is the former chairman of Google and now with Alphabet, its parent company, was asked at a conference, it's a security conference called RSA that happens every year, and he was asked at RSA about internet security and why it's so difficult to make the internet safe and secure. And he said, we now find ourselves back fixing the internet over and over again. You keep saying, why didn't we think about this? Well, the answer is, it didn't occur to us that there were criminals, right? That there was a kind of optimism and a naivete in the design of the internet and other kinds of networking technologies that really didn't anticipate the need to protect it from moral vice. And we could add, of course, that if you think about the way that Twitter is designed or Facebook was designed, they weren't designed with pathological liars in mind, or con artists, or racists, or sexists, or other people of deeply vicious character. And so these technologies are vulnerable to being co-opted by people for antisocial purposes. Well, that should have been clear from the beginning that that was likely to happen. So one question you might ask is, what sort of virtues are missing or inadequately developed in technologists who don't foresee how their designs might fail for non-technical reasons, right? Or be adapted for deeply antisocial purposes. So there's a kind of social naivete that can sometimes be harmful in technical design, or an unwillingness to take on social and political factors in thinking about design, and thinking about design only from a technical point of view. That can be very problematic. So there's a sort of lack of humility here, right? Thinking we understand the whole situation and the whole context. A lack of empathy, a lack of understanding, for example, how people might suffer as a result of leaving our systems open to hacking or to abuse. A sort of failure of perspective, thinking about the larger social whole and how the technology is going to enter into and interact with that. And just practical wisdom, right? Thinking about how to make the right kinds of judgments in a complex situation. Another case study I want to look at is that of Pepper, the emotional robot. Okay, here's some photos of Pepper. I don't know how well you can see that. Pepper's hugging a child there, talking to an adult. Okay, by the way, my problem here is not with Pepper at all. What I want to focus on is the media discourse around Pepper and the marketing of Pepper. So here's, and this is everywhere. If you Google Pepper the emotional robot, you'll get all kinds of headlines to this. My weekend with Pepper, the world's first humanoid robot with emotions. It's happening. Pepper robot gains emotional intelligence. Pepper, the emotional robot, learns how to feel like an American. Okay, whatever that means, I'm not sure what that means. Okay, let's be clear, Pepper has no emotions. Pepper has no emotional intelligence, right? Pepper's a pretty simple robot. It's quite clever, actually. What Pepper can do is recognize certain facial expressions that correlate, or certain gestures that correlate reasonably well with certain human emotional states. And it can respond in ways that are well attuned to, so it's a behavioral trick that mimics human empathy and emotional intelligence. But it's not, Pepper doesn't feel anything, and Pepper doesn't know anything about feelings. Pepper just knows some things about certain configurations of faces and bodies that it knows how to respond to. Okay, so the worry here is about the ways that technologies can be presented to us in manipulative fashion. So there's an interesting story here about what Pepper is actually being used for. So I'll read this very quickly. What's more interesting, so this is a news story about Pepper. What's more interesting than Pepper's supposed emotional quotient is its potential to know exactly what you're doing in a store. Right now, more than 10,000 of these robots have been deployed across Japan or are in pilot trials in Europe. The vast majority are being used in retail and hospitality businesses. A Pepper robot might know when you've entered a store, how much time you've spent there, how many products you interact with, and whether you seem happy or angry when you pick up a product. It will tell you that camera is 20% off in its innocent kid voice, its big eyes blinking at you, and make you think about buying that camera. The key word is empathy, right? Pepper creates empathy. But Pepper doesn't create empathy at all. Pepper exploits our mechanisms of empathy, right? Which we use in order to negotiate with one another and to get one another to do things, right? Well, manipulation is not inherently a bad thing, but when humans manipulate one another, we're usually somewhere on the same playing level, right? We're each vulnerable to one another. Pepper is not vulnerable at all, right? Pepper can't be emotionally manipulated, but we can be emotionally manipulated by Pepper. And to me, this is a thing that we ought to have some significant moral concerns about. So there's some great marketing around Pepper if you look at marketing from a cynical point of view. And Pepper could be a great product in certain applications. But the marketing misleads users about the product's capabilities. It responds to real human needs with a deception, with an artifice. It trivializes emotional relations. It reduces the concept of empathy to pro-social behavior, right? Behaving in ways that we like. And it exploits human emotions for commercial gain. So I think we should ask ourselves what sort of virtues would have resulted in a different marketing strategy, right? What sort of virtues are missing in technologists or marketers who mislead users and intentionally exploit their most basic moral needs? So we can think about an absence of honesty, empathy, care, justice or fairness, and again, of course, practical wisdom. I'm going to have one more sort of negative story, and then I'm going to turn it to a positive one, and then one I want you guys to think about. Okay, so Uber. This is a really easy one to pick on, right? Okay, great product, but it historically fails to respect user privacy or protect user data, displays inadequate concern for user safety, obstructs regulatory effects to investigate its practices. So it's done some very sneaky things with software to try to trick investigators and keep them from knowing what it's doing in particular cities. It has persecuted victims and complainants against its practices. It was recently revealed, for example, that a woman who was raped by an Uber driver in India, one of the chief executives at Uber had obtained illegally her medical records of the examination after her rape and was carrying it around and doing everything he could to try to convince people that she might have been lying about the rape or had been paid to make the accusations against the Uber driver by a competitor in India and so forth. And even other people at Uber were horrified by this, which is why they leaked it to the media. It's been relatively, at least if the legal accusations are accurate, again, this is unresolved as of now, but they've been accused of being a bad faith corporate actor with respect to patents, with respect to other companies like Google and Waze, so there's a big lawsuit around this. The exploitation of contingent labor. There was recently an article in the paper about the number of Uber drivers who are homeless and sleep in their cars and who have been actually manipulated by Uber into taking out large loans for expensive cars with the expectation that they'd be able to both make money and pay off the car loan. So a lot of these Uber drivers are underwater on their loans. And then, of course, most recently, the toxic culture of sexual harassment and discrimination that was exposed. So, I mean, if you ask what virtues might have prevented this, or what sort of virtues are missing or immature in technologists who knowingly violate a broad range of ethical and legal norms of practice, I mean, you can pretty much list all of them, right? So you have almost the example here, the rare example of a sort of perfect storm of vice, right? The absence of virtually every identifiable virtue. But as I said, I am not anti-technology, and I work with and meet all number of computer scientists, roboticists, designers, app developers who are profoundly concerned with making technologies that are good for people. And there are a lot of people out there doing very good work in this regard. So there's some very interesting things happening with virtual reality. So Oculus, the huge VR company, has a new initiative called VR for Good. And they promote the creation of virtual reality films that are intended to foster social empathy, that are intended to make people more aware of and responsive to the situations of people around the world. I'll give you some examples of that in a minute. Here's one. Step to the Line is a virtual reality film funded by Oculus that was recently accepted for the Tribeca Film Festival. And it's shot on location in a California maximum security prison. The documentary that aims to provide a transformation in the spectator's eyes about prisoners, the prison system, and themselves. In this project, the creators say, we see how release from incarceration can be just as jarring as intake, and how parallel lives diverge when someone serves time. So of course in America we have a huge social problem of over-reliance on prisons as a solution for social and political ills, and the ways in which this destroys human lives is really hard to appreciate from the outside. Well, what films like this allow us to do is feel like we're on the inside, to literally experience what others go through well, not literally, but to get a closer approximation of what others go through by using this kind of virtual reality technology. Similarly, Stanford University has a virtual human interaction lab where they're using virtual environments and virtual reality to develop technologies for creating stronger moral intuitions and feelings of empathy. So one of their projects allows you to embody an animal in an immersive virtual environment, to feel what it's like, for example, to be an animal in a threatened environment where you're scrambling to stabilize yourself in an environment that's constantly being destroyed or stripped away from you. And they've demonstrated that there are some lasting psychological and moral effects with experiencing these virtual simulations, where people, they say, have an increased sense of an inclusion of nature in their own identity and involvement with nature, right? And the research is still very, very thin here. We're still trying to figure out how powerful these technologies are. But it's remarkable that people are using these technologies not just for entertainment, but to try to cultivate moral responses and habits in us. So one of the Stanford projects tries to examine racism through this technology by putting oneself in an immersive environment where you can viscerally embody an avatar who encounters various forms of racism. And they've demonstrated that these sorts of simulations can actually make it easier for people to empathize with marginalized groups or with people who suffer from social exclusion. Or think about the way in which you might have a virtual reality simulation that gives you the experience of what it's like to be a disabled person in a community that doesn't have good accommodations for disability, right? And the kind of struggles that one goes through that for many of us are invisible until we find ourselves in that situation. And then we say, why doesn't anyone understand? Why doesn't anyone want to help me and the other community of disabled people have access to all the things in life that we had access to before? Well, this kind of technology can actually create that kind of understanding and potentially more responsiveness to the need. So we can use virtual reality films or games as empathy engines to bring us into an experience of the struggles and triumphs of the other, whether we're talking about communities, identities, or experiences that are often ignored or marginalized or stereotyped. It can promote moral optimism and moral imagination. It can foster moral attention, self-examination, the expansion of moral concern, habituation to patterns of virtuous action. Remember that all of these were practices that I said were at the heart of virtue traditions across cultures and historical periods. So this is the kind of technology that we could actually really embrace and develop for moral purposes. So think about how technologists can be encouraged to cultivate these kinds of virtues. There's certainly social pressures that we can bring to bear. Often internal criticism, right? There are a lot of companies where the motivation to develop these kinds of projects comes from the inside, from people within the company who really want to develop more pro-social initiatives. We can think about the ways that people think about design and building conceptions of virtue into design norms and practices, just the way that safety is already built into design norms and practices. We can think about how to develop models of virtuous engineering and models of virtuous design that might be taught in engineering schools and implemented in industry. The importance of moral habituation in engineering and design practice. And some of this just can be helped by mending the split between the humanities and the STEM disciplines, and bringing into engineering education some more humanistic perspectives. By the way, I also think it should work the reverse. I think there should be more emphasis on science and technology in the context within the humanities as well. So I think trying to mend the split goes both ways. Okay, I'm going to finish up in just a minute here. I'm just going to mention that we shouldn't only focus on the technologists, on the designers. It's also important to focus on our responsibilities as users and citizens. So the last case study I'm going to go through involves a sort of scenario, a dilemma. So I want you to think about a human resource decision support system that's powered by AI technology. Okay, and imagine that this algorithm is designed to rank job applicants using using a design that that tries to weed out the influence of race, gender, and class. And so the algorithm is explicitly tuned to ignore class bias and their data proxies. By the way, this is very difficult to do. If you just train AI algorithms on human-generated data, as we often do, they'll just replicate the same biases that we have, and they'll just pass right into the algorithm, right? So the algorithm does not automatically act objectively or neutrally. It has to be a very careful design practice to get it that way. But let's admit, but we can do this actually. So imagine we do this, right? So in this sense, then, we should have an algorithm that makes fairer decisions than humans in a human resources context, because we know humans are pervaded with bias against races and genders and people of different economic classes, and this goes into hiring decisions all the time. Okay, so imagine two applications of this. In one, you have the AI system do the rankings of the applicants, and then those rankings guide or determine how the humans prioritize or assign interviews or make hiring decisions, right? So you say, AI agent, tell me who should I interview? Give me the list. And then after the interview, okay, tell me based on the data we have, who should I hire? Okay. So version 2, the same system produces its rankings, but then the human HR person is asked to produce their rankings as well. And the AI compares its rankings with the humans and provides detailed feedback on the disparities, right? It says, hey, notice that I've ranked these people at the top, but you've ranked them in the middle or the bottom. And imagine that in this implementation that you've designed now, the human HR rep has to provide a justification for the variance, right? Has to say, well, this is why I don't think these candidates are as well qualified as you. Okay, so here's the question I want to ask you guys. Which of these designs is better from a virtue ethics perspective? And notice, it's not just about the algorithm's the same in both cases, right? It's about the techno-social practice, how you implement it. Which way would be a better way to implement it from a virtue ethics perspective? Yeah.
The second one.
Why?
Because you've got an opportunity to look at context and comparing, and you're actually building in a reflexivity into the practice.
Yeah, sure. Anyone else want to add anything to that? Yeah.
Yeah, I'd reinforce the second one, but because as you've highlighted, humans do have empathy.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can engage a wider range of moral faculties than a machine can.
Right, so there might be things that the machine has missed that are actually salient or significant. So you want to give the human an opportunity to have those considerations enter into it. Any other considerations here? Yeah.
I think the second one was probably better because the human still has a job.
That's a big factor, right? Yeah, and we have to think about that. But I want to think about the importance of the job, not just from an economic standpoint, although that's immensely important, but also the opportunity to exercise and develop our faculties, right? The first system doesn't give the human being any opportunity to learn. It doesn't give the human any opportunity to become fairer or more appropriately discerning of what's salient for a job and what's not, right? So we can use these technologies as moral mirrors sometimes to say, hey, look at what you're doing, and look at the way in which all of the applicants, with names that associate a non-European ethnicity have magically dropped to the bottom of your ranking, even though when you look at their degrees and their work history and their skill sets, they ought to be right up at the top there, right? And you can sort of, if you've got other reasons and you say, no, you misunderstand, I didn't rank them for that reason, okay, fine, but it gives you an opportunity to have to be accountable and to become a better, more just, more discerning person if you want to be. So I think one of the things that's really important about new technologies is thinking about, do they do the moral work for us, or do they help us, right, become better and do better moral work ourselves as people? Okay. I have some other things, but I want to leave some time for discussion, so I'm going to go through, if you guys want to talk about democracy and civic virtue, I got a lot of things to say about that, but I will. I'm just going to end with this one quote from one of my favorite philosophers, a Spanish philosopher from the mid-20th century, Jose Ortega y Gasset. He says, technology is strictly speaking not the beginning of things. It will mobilize its ingenuity and perform the task life is. It will, within certain limits, of course, succeed in realizing the human project. But it does not draw up that project. the final aims it has to pursue come from elsewhere. And it's clear that what he means is the final aims that, of the human project are up to us to decide. And part of what I think virtue does is help us think about our responsibility to decide the kind of future that we want and the kind of future that's worth living. Thank you.